Hello everyone. Welcome here. Let's start. Today we'll all talk about George Washington, President of the United States of America. George Washington, first President of the United States, 1789 to 1797, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary American War, and one of the founding fathers of the United States, was an opponent of separatists and led the revolt that ended with the proclamation of the United States secession on behalf of Britain on the 4th of July 1776. He also presided over the agreement that drafted the Constitution, which replaced the Articles of the Confederation, and established the post of President. The Washington Electoral College unanimously elected President in 1788, served 2 presidential terms, and oversaw the creation of a strong, well-funded national government, whose government maintained neutrality in raging wars in Europe, and suppressed the rebellion. It was accepted by all classes of Americans. During his leadership, George Washington established many precedents for governmental customs and traditions that have been in use since then, such as the cabinet system, the presidential division day, and the title of president. Moreover, he established the principle of a peaceful transition from his presidency to the presidency of John Adams in his retirement after 2 presidential terms, a custom that continued until 1940 when Franklin Roosevelt was elected to 3 presidential terms until this tradition returned in 1951 constitutionally in Amendment 22 to the Constitution that limits the 2-term presidential terms. These traditions are still used in the 21st century. Washington hailed him as the father of his country, even during his lifetime. He was born in Virginia to a family who practiced agriculture as the majority of the American people of that era. After completing his education, he joined the British Army in 1760, which was then the most powerful in America, and he hoped that he would be forgotten that he was a native of America so that he would not be exposed to any harassment in his military life, because he is an American. And when he was 20 years old, war broke out between the British and the French, when England was not at its best at the time. Unlike the French ended their problems in Canada and allied with the Red Indians, the battle took place in Western America, so the British were defeated and their leader was killed, and thus George assumed command of that region. The French went out victorious, leaving him with a weak army that could not harm them, and they went to the east to confront the British in other places, and the defeat was for the British in most battles until they were confined around the Mississippi River, and in the west at George, and passed for nearly 3 years, during which the King of England prepared an army its strength as 20 irregular soldiers. 18 cannons wrapped a siege, and that army landed and its commander contacted the Red Indians, some of whom were neutral, some of whom joined the English, and the British attacked the French, who had an army of 8,000 soldiers. It was not long before the British won, and North America became all of the British Crown. Injustice against the sons of America, especially the blacks, and heavy taxes were imposed. At that time, George Washington was the actual leader of the Americans, who led the Liberation Revolution. Then, in 1775 CE, he was chosen as the leader of this army to fight violent wars that ended after 6 years. As well as he has taken part in what known as the French Indian War. He was very successful in his work, who was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in the American Separatist War from 1775 to 1783, of which he led the New York and New Jersey campaign, and later was the President of the United States of America. Most hearsay and books say that he was elected twice in 1789 and in 1797. Historians say that he served first as an officer during the Franco-Indian War, and secondly as the leader of the colonial popular resistance that supported the British Empire. After leading the American victory in the Revolutionary War, he refused to lead the military regime, though some pushed him to do so, back to civilian life on Mount Vernon. Scientists rank him with Abraham Lincoln among the greatest American presidents. He adopted the policy of harassment in Britain and not to engage in major and direct confrontations. He also used France to expel the British from Cornwall and New York. He continued his efforts to establish a federal system between the states of America until finally culminating in the holding of a constitutional conference in Philadelphia in 1787. After the Constitution was approved at the Philadelphia Conference, the Electoral College unanimously elected him as President of the United States to begin ruling a country destined to be the largest power in the world. the first constitutional oath in the history of the United States, led on the balcony of the Senate building on April 30, 1789, to rule America for 2 consecutive terms from 1789 to 97. He was distinguished by his deep respect for the decisions of Congress, as he did not seek to override the constitutional powers of Congress. He worked to neutralize America and not involve it in the ongoing conflict between Britain and France, and he refused to take the views of many of his ministers into bias towards one of the 2 countries. Before the 3rd year ended, after the end of his 2nd term, he fell ill and died of it on December 14, 1799. Washington is running for a 2nd term. He refused to run for a 3rd term, setting martial policy for a maximum of 2 terms for the president. Judicial Decree of 1789. The U.S. Government Headquarters Decree of 1790 stipulates that the District of Columbia, near the Potomac River, be designated as the permanent seat of the American government, which was later named Washington, D.C. to become the capital of the United States of America. During his reign, in 1794, a rebellion known as the Whiskey Rebellion, which was caused by taxing whiskey in western Pennsylvania, broke out, and the insurgency failed, and 2 were arrested, giving them a presidential pardon. Presidential justice. In 1789, George Washington unanimously assumed the presidency of the United States of America, thereby becoming the first U.S. president to win the presidential election by 100%. He himself is a public servant of the state and the nation, but ultimately agreed after a long and persistent urge from the U.S. Senate. And now, Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion, also known as Whiskey Insubordination, is a tax protest that occurred in the United States beginning in 1791 during George Washington's presidency. The whiskey tax was the first tax imposed on a local product by the newly formed federal government. The tax became law in 1791, and was aimed at raising revenue to pay the war debts it incurred during the War of Independence. The tax was applied to all distilled spirits, but the American whiskey was the most popular distilled drink in the country in the 18th century, and thus this toll became known as the whiskey tax. In the western borders, farmers used to distill surplus rye, barley, wheat, corn, or fermented grain mixtures to produce whiskey. These farmers resisted that tax. Whiskey was sometimes used in these areas as a means of exchange. Most of the veterans saw that they were fighting for the principles of the American Revolution, especially against taxes without local representation, while the federal government confirmed that taxes are a legal expression of the tax authority in Congress. Demonstrators throughout West Pennsylvania counties used violence and intimidation to prevent federal officials from collecting the tax. The resistance reached its climax in July 1794, when U.S. Marshals arrived in the area to file orders for alcohol distillers who did not pay the toll. More than 500 armed men attacked the fortified home of the tax inspector and General John Neville. Washington's response was to send peace commissioners to western Pennsylvania to negotiate with the rebels, while the governors of the states simultaneously called for the sending of militia forces to tax. Washington personally took the head of an army to quell the revolt, with 13,000 militiamen provided by the governors of Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The rebels returned to their homes before the army arrived, and there were no clashes. About 20 men were arrested, but all were acquitted or amnesty. He found it impossible to tax most distillers in nearby Kentucky, and more than 175 Kentucky distillers were convicted in the next 6 years of violating the tax law. Several examples of resistance were recorded in court documents and newspaper records. The Whiskey Rebellion showed that the new national government had the will and ability to suppress violent resistance to its laws, even though the toll on whiskey remained difficult to assemble. These events contributed to the formation of political parties in the United States, a process that was already underway. The whiskey tax was abolished in the early 19th century during the Jefferson administration. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe my channel. Goodbye, my friends.